Okay, good morning, everyone, and good evening to our audience joining from Korea. Welcome to GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIX. I'm Yeon-ho Kim, Associate Director at GWIX. Thank you for joining our Korea Policy Forum. The forum is part of the policy program at GWIX, focusing on discussing current Korea-related policy issues in the domestic, regional, and global context. And today's forum is co-sponsored by the East Asia National Resource Center. And for your information, we will send out a separate email to the attendees with a survey on today's webinar. So please fill it out and send back to us. It will be greatly appreciated. So the COVID-19 pandemic imposed unprecedented economic challenges to both the U.S. and South Korea. And while dealing with the immediate task, Seoul and Washington will have to explore the path to post-pandemic economic cooperation. The allies have much to offer to each other and much to gain from their ever-evolving practical partnership on many key economic policy fronts. And today I'm very delighted to have distinguished experts on our panel on this very important topic. Our speaker is Ambassador Terry Miller, the Director of Center for International Trade and Economics, and Mark A. Kolokotrones Fellow in Economic Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. He is editor of a signature heritage publication, which is the annual Index of Economic Freedom. And before joining Heritage, he served as an ambassador to the United Nations, U.S. representative on the UN's Economic and Social Council, and also Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic and Global Issues at the State Department. And our discussant is Dr. Won-hyuk Lim. He is a professor at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, and now a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Dr. Lim served as Associate Dean of Office of Development Research and International Cooperation at the KDI School, and Vice President and Director of Department of Competition Policy at KDI. And he also worked for the Presidential Transition Committee and the Presidential Committee on Northeast Asia. A quick announcement. After the panel discussion, we will have a Q&A session. We'll be taking questions from the attendees even before we open it up to Q&A. So please keep that in mind. And when you type in your questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, please make sure to identify your name and also affiliation. With that, let me turn it over to Ambassador Miller.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning. I want to thank the GW Institute for Korean Studies at the Elliott School, and also the East Asia National Resource Center for organizing this seminar. I'm delighted to be able to share a few thoughts with you about the future of economic cooperation between the United States and South Korea. I look forward to the discussion a little later in the program. The United States and South Korea share a relationship that's really unique among our closest friends and allies. We don't often think of it, but many of our alliances today are with countries that we once fought against. Japan and Germany are obvious examples, but in the early days of our republic, it was with England that we were most often at war, and then with Spain or its colonies such as Mexico. So enemies can become friends. But Americans and South Koreans have never been enemies. Our relationship was forged in the struggles of World War II and in its aftermath, in the struggle against communist aggression from China and Russia. Fighting together against common enemies has forged a relationship between us that's based on mutual respect and common values. Today, those values include democracy, capitalism, respect for human rights, religion, much, much more. There are more than 1.7 million people of Korean heritage living in the United States, and at least 130,000 Americans living in Korea. Korean American families are common in both countries. In fact, the relationship between South Korea and the United States is actually more like a marriage than a friendship. We support each other, we defend each other, and we depend on each other. Occasionally we argue with each other. I come to the issue of U.S.-Korean relationship by what I suspect is a little different pathway than most of you. I want to take you just a short way down that path with me as I begin my presentation. I want to share my screen with you now. This will take just a moment. Right. Since I retired from the U.S. diplomatic service, I've been working on a project called the Index of Economic Freedom for the Heritage Foundation. This project evaluates public policies in countries all over the world. We measure what we call the March of Freedom. We publish an annual ranking of countries that reflects the degree of their commitment to economic freedom. It's a little small on the screen here, but if you look closely, you can see the United States and Korea ranked near one another in the group of countries we consider mostly free. The United States has lost a bit of ground in recent years in our index, but South Korea has progressed nicely, and the economic freedom gap between the two countries has narrowed significantly. That's an interesting change, and there are likely, of course, to be many factors at work. South Korea is particularly interesting as a country that has successfully made the transition to high income status. The factors that made that transition possible are complicated. They depend in large part, of course, on the character and hard work of the Korean people. But in international economics, we're always looking for the policies that can promote and nourish economic growth and development. And that's made Korea one of the most relevant case studies for us. Today, we're gathered to talk about ways to ensure that Korea's remarkable progress continues into the future, and in particular, ways in which to build on the already great relationship between the U.S. and South Korea, so that both countries will continue to benefit and benefit even more from economic cooperation in the future. My colleague Anthony Kim and I have recently published a paper identifying 5 areas for enhanced cooperation between the two countries. I'd like to highlight briefly each of the paper's recommendations. The first and definitely most important recommendation in the paper is to maximize the utility of the KORUS Free Trade Agreement. The Heritage Foundation was a big supporter of the KORUS Agreement, and as director of the Foundation's Center for International Trade, I was strongly engaged in working on behalf of its implementation. More recently, I've been privileged to serve as the chairperson of the Washington Advisory Council of the Korean International Trade Association. And that group brings together a large mix of Korean and American stakeholders, all of whom have a strong interest in the successful functioning of the KORUS Agreement. As you can see from this slide, KORUS has been a big success. Trade between the two countries has expanded significantly since 2011. U.S. goods exports to Korea are up over 30%. Korean goods exports to the U.S. have grown even more, 36.7%. U.S. services exports to Korea are up an astounding 44%, and Korea's services exports to the U.S. have grown as well. The people of the United States and South Korea have been investing in each other's economy as well. Korean investment in the U.S. has almost tripled since 2011. And U.S. investment in Korea is up by over 40%. These numbers are all large, they're all positive. It reflects the growing stake we have in each other's economic health. As we recover our physical health following the coronavirus pandemic, it's vital, I think, that these trade and investment flows between Korea and the United States continue to grow, and continue to grow in both directions. Our second recommendation is to get South Korea involved in something called the Blue Dot Network. This is a joint initiative of the United States, Japan, and Australia, and it's designed to promote high-quality investment in developing countries. Some people have characterized this as a counterpoint to China's Belt and Road Initiative, but it's really about promoting high standards of transparency and accountability in investment and financial transactions related to infrastructure projects in particular. The Blue Dot is intended to serve as a sort of check mark of excellence, and it should assure developing countries that the proposed investments or programs that they're evaluating meet the highest standards and that there will be no surprises down the line. Well, if China sees that as a threat, so be it, that's on them. But South Korea, as an important investor in developing countries, is an obvious candidate to join with the U.S., Japan, and Australia in this initiative. The next recommendation is to launch a bilateral 5G and biotechnology consortium. What we're really thinking about is for Washington and Seoul to work together to create a pragmatic framework of public policies and activities that would support the development of core 5G and medical technologies. The goal here is enabling greater and more strategic commercialization of secure telecommunications networks, as well as advancing public health security and capacity. 5G is an area in which the U.S. and Korea, as world leaders in technology, must both play a leading role. It's important that our governments put in place the right mix of policies to facilitate the great work of our private sector companies. And those companies are helping build the communications world of tomorrow. Recommendation 4 in our paper is to advance energy trade between the U.S. and South Korea. South Korea is a major importer of oil and natural gas, and the U.S. is now one of the world's largest producers of both. The synergy here is obvious, and this chart shows the rapid growth of the trade in recent years. The imperative here is for governments really to stay out of the way and impose no artificial barriers to the future growth of this trade and energy between our two countries. Frankly, I'm a little more worried about the U.S. than I am about Korea in this regard. U.S. trade policy has been somewhat more volatile than Korea's in recent years, and there is a risk that the U.S. administration could take some action to interfere with this trade, really, or any trade at a given moment. Still, I think it's vital that South Korea, that the Korean government continue to emphasize the importance it attaches to this trade in its own talks with Washington. Our final recommendation is to enlarge the scope of cooperation between the United States and South Korea in promoting global development based on our shared values. South Korea's new Southern policy and the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy both have at their base a shared vision of a region and indeed a world in which countries partner together through trade and the sharing of knowledge to advance the health, security, and prosperity of people everywhere. I've highlighted here two concrete cases of countries where the U.S. and South Korea can further cultivate and expand practical development cooperation in critical areas such as healthcare and information technology in Africa. In Ghana, for example, the U.S. and Samsung are working together to promote information technology in the healthcare services provision. Rwanda is not quite as well developed at this point, but it's one of the fastest growing countries in Africa and certainly one of the fastest growing in economic freedom. The U.S. and South Korea both have diplomatic missions there. They're both heavily involved there, and it's a great opportunity, I think, a great place for more cooperation. My co-author of this paper, Anthony Kim, and I both believe that the relationship between the United States and South Korea is really far deeper, though, than our transactions of the moment or even our responses to the joint challenges we face. It's a relationship based on shared values and a deep commitment to democratic and free market development, and to cultural values that support the human rights of individuals and families. We believe that the relationship between our two countries is strong, like a family is strong, and that tough times, well, we're certainly in tough times right now, tough times bring out the best in us. Our paper suggests 5 specific areas where we believe some relatively modest actions are possible to further enhance the relationship. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss them, and I look forward to your questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Miller. Thank you for your comprehensive and forward-looking recommendations. And let me turn it over to Dr. Lim to learn more about Korea's views on your recommendations.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed reading Anthony Kim and Ambassador Miller's paper, as well as Ambassador Miller's presentation. And what I wanted to do was to prepare something of a complementary discussion material that puts Korea's external economic strategy or international economic strategy in the era of COVID-19, basically, or after the era of COVID-19. And as Ambassador pointed out, there are a number of issues United States and Korea can cooperate on. But there's one big issue, sort of an elephant in the room, that we need to discuss because it's creating a lot of uncertainty going forward for Korea's international economic strategy, and that is U.S.-China decoupling, or at least the discussion of U.S.-China decoupling. So I'll focus on that topic in my presentation. So let me share the slides here. Okay. Well, I think it would be useful to put some historical perspective on this issue. As you know, Korea was divided at the end of World War II. Korean people suffered an internationalized civil war, the Korean War, in 1950 to 53. Just last week marked the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, and really remained on the front line of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. Right? As Ambassador Miller alluded to, Korea building on its domestic reform, like land reform and education reform, successfully rode the second wave of globalization that started in the wake of World War II through export-oriented industrialization. In a sense, this was a half globalization until 1989, because before the former socialist bloc was fully integrated into the world economy, it was only the free world that really globalized or integrated together. Since Korea was democratized and the Cold War came to a close in the late 1980s, Korea has sought to maintain a strong alliance with the United States on the one hand, but at the same time also develop good relations with its neighbors in Northeast Asia, China, Russia, Japan, and so on, so as to minimize the risks of conflict on the Korean Peninsula and facilitate reunification. That was basically the geopolitical thinking, at least since the late 1980s. How to prevent tension between maritime powers on the one hand and continental powers on the other, and promote cooperation. Okay. Trade policy, Korea's trade policy reflected this kind of geopolitical thinking, and Korea has maintained strong support for multilateral trading regime, GATT, and later WTO, based on the principles of non-discrimination and progressive liberalization. And when multilateral trading regime became difficult to make a lot of progress with the multilateral trading regime since the early 1990s, really, and especially after the conclusion of the Uruguay round, Korea made proactive efforts to sign bilateral FTAs, free trade agreements, as well as CEPAs, comprehensive economic partnership agreements, starting with sort of an exploratory FTA with Chile in 2004, Singapore, another small country, relatively small country, where signing an FTA, where a bilateral FTA would not cause a lot of domestic political problems. And then Korea became more ambitious and signed FTAs with ASEAN, India, and so on. The dates I included here are the years when the FTAs became effective rather than when they were signed. So after signing, ratification, these FTAs became effective. And as you know, U.S. Korea or KORUS FTA became effective in 2012, and Ambassador Miller just compared and contrasted the bilateral trade between Korea and the United States in 2011, before the KORUS FTA became effective, and 2019 just now. And Korea didn't stop there. It had FTAs with Australia, Canada, China, Vietnam, and most recently it signed an FTA with Indonesia. So as you can see from the list of the countries with which Korea has FTAs or CEPAs, it's on all fronts basically. And as far as mega regional, or regional cooperation was concerned, Korea's basic strategy was to go for inclusive regional cooperation. So, building on APEC, work toward FTAAP or FTAP, a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, instead of siding only with the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or TPP, at the exclusion of the United States or China. So, participate in RCEP as well as TPP, and build toward FTAP, which would basically include all the major players in the Asia Pacific. By the way, Korea has bilateral FTAs with all members of the RCEP and TPP, except for Japan and Mexico. So, the marginal effect that Korea could derive by, joining RCEP or TPP is not on the membership side, but rather on the quality of rules that RCEP or TPP would have. So that was basically the strategy: strong support for multilateral trading regime, proactive effort on bilateral FTAs, and building toward inclusive regional cooperation. But in recent years, as I alluded to at the outset, there's increasing uncertainty with regard to U.S.-China decoupling. And the thing is, even though I have asked a number of my American friends and scholars, experts, and so on, nobody seems to define precisely what decoupling means. It means different things to different people. Right? One school, to simplify a bit, one school seems to define it as something like hyper-vetting. So, at the margin, you don't try to increase economic interaction with China anymore. So there's going to be much tougher screening of, say, Chinese investments in the United States, and so on. But you don't really try to change the start of interaction, if you will, the existing interaction between U.S. and China so much. On the at the other extreme, there's a school that calls for full separation. Right? So, as if they were alluding to something like the economic relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Right? And there are people like Kevin Rudd who talked about who has talked about ideas of like Cold War 1.5, whatever that means. But this is the key uncertainty that is faced by Korea at this moment as it tries to formulate its international economic strategy. Now, let me show you how things have changed for Korea over the past 30 years, from 1989 to 2019. 1989 being really the last year of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, the year when the Berlin Wall came down. Right? And 2019 as sort of the beginning, or as Henry Kissinger said, foothills of U.S.-China Cold War with a question mark where it's headed. And what this slide shows is Korea's major trading partners in 1989 versus 2019. Let's look at 1989 first. In 1989, Korea's total exports amounted to $62.4 billion. And the top 10 trading partners, or top 10 export markets for Korea at the time, in percentage terms, were the United States, Japan, Hong Kong, and so on. In fact, United States and Japan together accounted for more than 50% of Korea's exports in 1989. On the import side, Japan and U.S. Put together accounted for, once again, more than 50% of Korea's imports. What's interesting in 1989 is that China is nowhere to be found on the export side. I looked it up, and it was number 19 in 1989 on the list of Korea's export markets. And on the import side too, you don't see China here. You don't see China until at number 5, at a much lower scale, at a much lower share than Japan or the United States. In fact, as you probably know, Korea didn't have formal diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union until 1990, and with China until 1992. So during Cold War 1.0, Korea was really decoupled from China and Russia. Now in 2019, you have a completely different picture. Okay. China became Korea's largest trading partner. In fact, China became Korea's #1 export market in 2003, okay? And it became Korea's #1 importing partner in 2007. So it's more than 10 years ago that China became the top trading partner for Korea. And on the export side, as you can see, countries like Vietnam and India, came to the fore. And what's interesting is that on the export side, there's no European country in top 10. Germany is number 11, actually. And Japan faltered quite a bit. As you see, Japan accounted for 21.6% in 1989 out of Korea's total exports. It's only 5.2% in 2019. Now, on the import side too, China is #1 trading partner for Korea. United States is #2, but it's about at half China's share of China's import share. And Japan is further behind. And what you see is a country like Vietnam increasingly, becoming an alternative to China for light manufacturing products. And while Japan and Germany remain important sources of machinery and equipment, with the development of the Korean economy too, Korea's dependence on these countries has decreased quite a bit. Okay. So if we are to talk about U.S.-China decoupling and entertain the possibility of Cold War 2.0, we are working with a completely different picture these days. Okay. So let me go to the third and last slide with some food for thought in terms of policy challenges going forward. Okay. Well, as a middle power, it is in Korea's interest to support a rule-based order rather than a discretion-based order or power-based order. And the key thing about rule-based order is the principle of equality before law, if you will. So you have to, if you have a given set of rules, everybody's supposed to follow, whether it's a great power or lesser power or developing country or whatever, right? Now, to make such a multilateral regime palatable to great powers, we make compromises, right? And they express themselves, these compromises express themselves in the form of veto power, like the veto power exercised by permanent members of the Security Council, and so on. But what you try to do if you are a middle power like Korea is to support this multilateral regime based on the principle of equality before law, while compromising on exceptions for some veto power. But try to have this veto power somewhat, limited, so that it's not going to be a discretion-based order. And the other thing with respect to rule-based order is you like to focus on the kinds of rules that address the problem of President's dilemma and the tragedy of the commons. How countries together can deal with sort of collective action problems, common challenges, and so on, without having a supranational state. Right? So that's the kind of thing Korea needs to think about with regard to rule-based order. The second challenge for Korea, I think, is the idea of expandable cooperation. I already talked about the idea of building toward FTAP and not just joining RCEP or TPP. And the basic idea is to have something like inclusive cooperation that could work for everyone. You start thinking about an intersection of interests first, and possibly a compatibility of standards and systems going forward. So you like to form a coalition and build a system of rules that can be accepted by everyone ultimately, and hopefully more through the force of logic than the logical force, diplomatic jargon, if you will. And finally, the third challenge or third thing to think about for Korea is reconfiguration of global value chains, especially in the wake of COVID-19. And I think three lessons really present themselves, given our experience with COVID-19 and other shocks to the global trading system. The first lesson is to build a strategic stockpile and secure a domestic manufacturing base for essential supplies. Okay, so and this predates COVID-19. Korea had, some experience with China in 2016 after the deployment of THAAD, and also with Japan in 2019 after Japan put stronger export regulations on three critical materials for semiconductor manufacturing. Right? So you like to build a strategic stockpile, be they ventilators, masks, or semiconductor materials, and secure also a domestic manufacturing base. Right? The second lesson is to diversify and multi-source to deal with idiosyncratic risks. Some factory might catch fire. There may be a natural disaster or man-made disaster at some, factory too. So you like to diversify and multi-source. And the important thing with respect to this lesson is this mainly has to do with idiosyncratic risks or non-correlated risks. Now, in the case of Korea's experience with Japan in 2019, Samsung had already developed some kind of vendor diversification. It was relying on multiple sources within Japan for its supply of semiconductor materials. But it did not diversify in terms of importing countries or country diversification. So when Japan as a country put stronger export regulations in place, three vendors, Japanese vendors, were all subject to these stronger rules, and Samsung was caught off guard. So you need to think about how to diversify and multi-source in a careful way. Now, the third lesson has to do with COVID-19, really. Now, if you think about it, COVID-19 is a pandemic, literally meaning that this epidemic has affected just about every country in the world. So you're not dealing with an idiosyncratic risk. It's a correlated risk. So you cannot really escape from this kind of correlated risk by just risk diversification. You need to think about national capability to deal with crises in addition to the usual economic considerations. So if you are building regional value chains or global value chains, you need to consider not only the cost, productivity, logistics, and market size of the host country, but also the host country's ability to deal with crises. Okay? And if you think about it that way, the funny thing is you are back to countries like China, Vietnam, that have both strong economic merits as well as national capability to deal with crises. So in my view, yes, GVCs or RVCs, regional value chains, would be are going to be reconfigured in the wake of COVID-19. But what's likely to happen is something like China plus a few strategy, where multinational corporations would diversify somewhat to make sure that you don't put everything in China. But at the same time, if you screen national capability to deal with crises, there aren't that many developing countries that satisfy the economic considerations as well as national capacity considerations. So it'll be something like China plus a few strategy, in my view. Of course, the big question in the end is there something like a geopolitical consideration that overrides everything? Okay? But as I said, unlike Cold War 1.0, when there was hardly any value chain extending from the socialist bloc to the capitalist countries, we are now in a very different world. So I think these are the things that Korean policymakers to consider going forward when they formulate international economic strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lim. Thank you for your deep analysis of the elephant in the room. And I think Ambassador Miller would have something to respond to Dr. Lim's comments.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. I very much appreciate Dr. Lim's analysis, and frankly, I agree with most of it. I do want to emphasize one thing, though, that separates the issues related to economic relationships and trade apart from the larger issues of geostrategy and geopolitics. Obviously, our main interest in China, I think, for both Korea and the United States, is to have a China that is peaceful and that doesn't threaten its neighbors in any way whatsoever. And to the extent that happens is largely outside of our control. It's largely in the control of the Chinese people themselves and their government and their relationship with their government. Trade's a bit different, even when you talk about the idea of rules-based. The system of rules-based international trade, the rules aren't very severe in that system. You take an organization like the WTO, it's based on the World Trade Organization, it's based on voluntary cooperation. Countries come to it, they bring their own interests. They can use it as a forum for discussion. They can use it as a place to mediate disputes sometimes, but it really doesn't, there's not a long list of statutory rules or laws that countries really have to obey. And that's one of the main characteristics of trade, which is that it needs to be voluntary at all times. And so in a case like the United States and Korea, both sides, in effect, have a veto over what kinds of trade will happen between our countries. And South Korea has a veto over its trade with any other country, in effect. I think we have learned from the value of the free market that we grow prosperity, we grow our economies, we create the most economic opportunity when our governments don't veto very much economic activity, basically when governments get out of the way and let companies and individuals make the decisions for themselves. You talk about the decoupling between the United States and China, and frankly, I don't think anyone knows exactly where that's going. You posited two different views that are certainly either one is possible. I don't think the President of the United States knows where exactly he wants to go with this. There's a huge element of domestic U.S. politics involved in these decisions right now, perhaps predominating even over the economic questions. At the same time, the U.S. has enormous interests in Chinese economic activity and in the U.S.-Chinese economic relationship. So that's not something that's going to be decoupled from in a casual manner. It's going to be done in a very careful manner, and certainly I would think it's unlikely that it would be done in a complete or comprehensive manner. I think it's much more likely that we'll focus on the hyper-vetting kind of strategy that you talked about, particularly in areas where technological cooperation or technology trade, and this gets to the 5G area, of course, immediately, where that creates security vulnerabilities that I think have to be taken into account, as long as the Chinese system is tending towards a totalitarian system with very little respect for human rights or frankly the norms of rule of law that the rest of us have internalized and live by every day. The whole intention, I think, of the initial opening towards China was to try to encourage Chinese reform so that the Chinese would, in their economic dealings and in all of their dealings, become more like Korea, frankly, more like Japan, more like the United States, that they would adopt a more democratic system, that they would have greater respect for human rights, and that they would respect the norms of intellectual property and commercial law that the rest of us live by. I think that has in fact happened to some extent, but not to the extent that we would have hoped. And we all have a big stake in what happens in China going forward. So I think it's important that we continue the effort to encourage reform in China and encourage them to accept these international norms by which our companies and our people interact with one another. There are plenty of good examples in the way U.S. and Korea, we don't have identical systems, but we share a lot of values, and we have found ways to cooperate peacefully and with the benefit of people in both our countries. And that certainly ought to be possible between China and South Korea and China and the United States. I don't think it's appropriate for the United States to try to make a country like Korea choose between China and the United States. And I don't, in fact, think that the U.S. government will try to do that. I think we'll try to continue, as we have with the KORUS agreement, to keep the relationship between the United States and South Korea strong. And then what South Korea does with China is, frankly, South Korea's business. There's no question that if South Korea went in certain directions, chose to, for example, develop 5G with Huawei intimately in some way, that could have repercussions for its relationship with the United States. If the U.S. decides, as we have, I think our government has, to sever a large part of its relationship with Huawei and in certain areas of technology. So there would be consequences there, but that's up to South Korea to decide where the costs and benefits are for the South Korean people. It's not for the U.S. to decide. I think I'll stop there. I've been talking quite a while.
Can I respond a little bit? Or?
Yes, please, briefly.
Okay, briefly. I think on issues like state-owned enterprises, state aid, intellectual property, and so on, I agree with Ambassador Miller that it would be best to come up with good rules, good system of rules, and have every country accept those rules. Now, the best way to go about doing that, the best way to do that would be to have some kind of coalition, either through TPP or even in a multilateral trading regime that would have these rules in place, right? And probably offer China or other countries that the price that they would have to pay for joining this, coalition or partnership would be to accept these norms. But I don't see this kind of approach so much under the current administration in the United States. It's all bilateral, so I don't know, how that'll work would be the first thing. My last comment is on things like 5G, standards, technology development, and so on. On 5G, for instance, you have companies like Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, and ZTE, the top five for manufacturing 5G equipment. And here, I think basically countries are going to choose depending on who they feel comfortable with. For instance, Russia is choosing to go with Huawei. Okay, but Canada, for instance, even though they had worked with Huawei in the previous generation, they have now switched to Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung basically, and that's going to happen. And what's going to be important for standards and systems going forward is first security, right? But the second aspect would be sort of compatibility, how things will work between different systems. Okay? So those are the issues that we really need to tackle going forward if we are interested in promoting international economic cooperation.
Thank you. We have around 10 minutes left, and let me open it up for Q&A. I have two questions from Georgina Henwood. With the prospect of greater economic nationalism, how important is the enhancement of bilateral trade between the U.S. and Korea? And the next question is, what potential does U.S. domestic fragility have in disturbing the economic cooperation between the two nations? I think our panelists briefly touched upon these questions, so you may want to address both or either of them. Mr. Miller, did you want to go first?
Sure. Let me just talk a little bit about bilateralism, and this also touches on the nationalism issue. The U.S. has certainly made a turn away, our administration has made a turn away from multilateralism, but that doesn't mean the U.S. is abandoning the multilateral system or the idea of multilateral trade agreements. We just redid our multilateral trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. The U.S. did pull out of the TPP, and the U.S. has taken a very unilateral, even rather than bilateral approach to its trade relations with this administration. But I would like to emphasize that the talk has been larger than the action in many cases. I certainly personally never agree with the imposition of tariffs. I think tariffs are a terrible tool. And yet that's one of the favored tools of this administration right now. Again, I would emphasize the domestic political nature of this, particularly in a presidential election year, where different areas of our country in the United States have different views, and it may be seen as valuable by one or another of the candidates to propose greater trade restrictions. But getting back to the question of bilateral versus multilateral, I don't think it's an either-or question. I think you can do both. The United States and South Korea can build through the KORUS agreement and outside of that agreement even can build very positive bilateral trade relationships and have negotiations about bilateral trade issues. And at the same time, both of us can participate in other places with other countries. And again, this all happens on a voluntary basis. No one is dictating what people do in this case. So I think as long as people carefully evaluate the pros and cons of the various things, the costs and benefits of what they do, everything will turn out all right, actually.
Thank you. Dr. Lim, do you have any comments?
Oh, I have nothing to add to that, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from Michael Chekim. Do both nations, Korea and the United States, share the same values, vision on global health, NPT, sustainable environment, and fair, humane development of underdeveloped economies lacking infrastructure and basic health? Dr. Lim, did you want to go first?
I mean, both countries have, played an important role in the formulation of Sustainable Development Goals, or Agenda 2030. And the current pandemic has highlighted the need for greater cooperation on things like public health internationally. So as Ambassador Miller pointed out in his presentation, I think there's a lot that can be done on global development cooperation issues between Korea and the United States.
Yeah, can I add to that? I spent a lot of years working in the United Nations in multilateral organizations, and people place a lot of emphasis on things like the Sustainable Development Goals or on international agreements on areas like this. But those agreements tend to be very superficial, and in many cases, countries go along with them, but they're honored in the breach rather than in the fulfillment. There's a lot of posturing and a lot of really just advertising that goes on. People trying to make themselves look good. But I think if you get to the essentials on all of the issues that the questioner asked, whether it's sustainable development, environmental protection, global development that respects the rights of the people in the developing countries, I think the U.S. and South Korea do, in fact, share the fundamental values. We may have a few disagreements about the actual factual situation in some of these cases. There's a huge debate within the United States, for example, concerning the actual facts surrounding global warming. How severe is it? Where's it going? What's the prospects for the future? What's the actual cost, either now or in the future? All of these issues they're issues of fact rather than purpose. There's nobody that denies that we want to have a safe, secure environment for people. Nobody favors pollution. Nobody favors the rise of the oceans. Nobody favors any of these bad things that some people are predicting will happen. And everyone would want to take reasonable actions to prevent that or to mitigate against the impact of that. But we're not really sure of what the situation is. And I think a little humility, even in the face of this COVID-19 crisis, we've had a lot of differences of opinion, at least within the United States, about what the actual factual situation is about the risks associated with various kinds of economic activity. So I think it's really important that we not question each other's motives or intentions or indeed values between countries like the United States and South Korea. There are so many occasions throughout history where we've proven our friendship, our like-mindedness towards these things. And I think that's a really strong basis for cooperation in all of these areas.
Thank you, Ambassador Miller. We have run out of almost all the time we planned. But let me ask you one brief question. The last question. I'd like to follow up on Dr. Lim's analysis on the trade dispute between Korea and Japan. How do you think this challenge should be addressed in the context of a pandemic economic cooperation between the U.S. and Korea? And do you think your answer will be, at least in part, depending on who the next U.S. president will be? Just briefly.
Well, I guess I'll start. You mentioned the problems between South Korea and Japan, and of course, these are two countries that are both close allies and friends of the United States, and we hate it when our friends and allies fight among themselves. And obviously, there's some very strongly felt and emotionally felt issues between South Korea and Japan that date back to to World War II and even before. So there's a lot of history behind that, and I would just say I would hope that both sides to those agreements can approach them with open hearts. I would say open minds, but open hearts as well, and try to focus on how to move to the future in the most positive way. I do think that trade relations, moving to the second part of your question, I do think relationships between the United States and all of its friends and allies may change a bit depending on who wins the next presidential election. They may change even if President Trump is reelected. It's very hard to anticipate where this particular administration is going with some of its policy directions, and there's not always a clear line that we all can see and understand in that. But what's not going to change is the fundamental importance of the U.S.-South Korean relationship, I think, to both countries. The world that we live in is not going to change radically in a fast way. We're still going to have to deal with China, both individually and collectively. We're going to have to deal with North Korea, and that'll certainly be a collective endeavor between the U.S. and South Korea. And we need to work with all the other countries, both in the region and around the world, on these pressing international issues. And as long as we do that with openness and in a cooperative spirit, I have no fears for the future whatsoever.
Thank you. Dr.
For Korea-Japan dispute or whatever, I think basically over the past year, Korea has used a combination of domestic manufacturing base, as well as a combination of domestic manufacturing base and other sources like Germany and the United States, companies like DuPont, to take care of the three semiconductor materials. And as far as the essential supplies are concerned, I think that lesson is going to be applied in other cases too, given the uncertainty of geopolitics going forward. And as far as the Trump administration is concerned, I think that has been deeply transactional. So you don't really know what's going to happen, and it's really case by case. And if there's a change in government, a change in administration in November, I think the administration is going to take a different approach. But here too, I would argue that it's very important to have something like a partnership and plurilateral approach that eventually works into expandable cooperation rather than just Cold War 2.0.
Thank you. I think we had a really great and exciting discussion today. It's really amazing we can touch upon all the important issues just within an hour. So I think we did a very good job. With that, let me conclude today's webinar. I'd like to thank Ambassador Miller and Dr. Lim for taking some time, and our technical team for putting this together. And thank you all for joining us. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.